I want to start by talking a little bit about a very important Bible character and also a man that I am named after, Jacob. Jacob is a really interesting character. He lived a long life of struggle, and it was often a struggle of his own making. Our shared name means something like schemer or trickster or overreacher, and this Jacob very much lived up to that name. You may know some stories about Jacob. As a young man, he twice tricked his father Isaac and his brother Esau so that Jacob got Esau's firstborn inheritance and this special blessing from Isaac that was meant for Esau. And after those two incidences, Esau somewhat understandably wanted to kill Jacob. So he had to run away from home. And while he was fleeing out in kind of the wilderness one night, he has this dream where he sees a stairway to heaven with angels going up and down, and he meets God. And God promises to carry on a covenant that was made with Jacob's grandfather Abraham through Jacob. And then Jacob promises that if God will take care of him, then Jacob will serve God. So he agrees, but he's adding some security for himself here. And then Jacob keeps traveling. He makes his way to the home of his uncle Laban, and he works there for at least a couple decades. He marries two of Laban's daughters, has a bunch of kids. And over those years, Jacob and Laban have this very strained relationship. They kind of take turns tricking each other in these major ways, so it's a very tumultuous time. And over this time, Jacob seems to forget about this promise that he made to God. That is until one day God shows up and reminds Jacob of this promise that he made, and he calls him to go back to his homeland. And eventually Jacob listens. He sets out with his family, understandably dreading facing his brother Esau after so many years. And then one night, this long journey that they're on is almost over, and Jacob is preparing his family to meet Esau when this happens. Genesis 32, verses 22 through 31. The same night, he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. May God bless the reading and hearing of our Holy Scriptures. This story is nuts. I mean, it's hard to even figure out what to say about it. You know, there are a lot of passages and stories in the Bible that really benefit from diving deep into historical context and kind of careful word by word interpretation of the original languages. And then there are stories like this. Stories that are so strange and visceral and impactful that trying to over-explain them can actually detract from their impact. You know, I did my homework in preparing for this sermon, and I could tell you some stuff about ancient traditions of stories of people fighting with demons and how maybe the story about Jacob kind of grew out of that tradition, but I think this story wants to be felt more than it wants to be understood. This is a story about Jacob having a literal wrestling match with God, okay? And of course, he doesn't know that until after the fact, which must have been quite a revelation, right? There was a common belief at this time that if anybody saw God's face, that it would kill them immediately. So imagine Jacob's feeling when he realizes that not only did he just see God, but him and God went to fisticuffs. They fought, and not only did Jacob not die, he didn't lose the fight. They fought all night, and God wasn't winning. So God dislocated Jacob's hip and then asked Jacob to let him go, and Jacob said no. Okay? He says, not until you bless me. And then Jacob does eventually get that blessing that he asked for, but not right away, of course. First, God asks Jacob his name, and Jacob says Jacob. And then God says, oh no, you're not Jacob, the schemer. You are Israel. Now, the kind of traditional English interpretation of the name Israel is he who wrestles with God. That is the name that God gives Jacob. Israel, the God wrestler. God gives Jacob that name, and it's a compliment. And then the wrestling match ends, and this new person, Israel, walks away, and he's limping, but he has received his blessing, and he has persevered. This story is so weird and so counterintuitive, and it is so true to what a long-term life of faith is like. You know, I've been a person of faith trying to live in connection with God for my whole life, and I'm so grateful for that. But it hasn't been all like sunshine lollipops this whole time. Me and God have gone a few rounds over the years. I very much see myself in this story. You know, I was in high school the first time that God tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you're going to work in the church someday. And I said, no way. I'm going to be an English teacher. So I went to college and tried that, and it was immediately a disaster. I wasn't making the grades I needed to continue majoring in education. I was at a point where I needed to change my major. And in one of the few times where I can confidently say that God spoke to me, God said, hey, you're going to major in Christian ministry now. And I said, I am not working in the church. And God said, sure you're not. Skip forward a year, I had to do a practicum for one of my ministry classes, and the only real opportunity I got was to intern at a children's ministry at a church. So I did that for 2 years, surprisingly ended up really liking it. So I went back to God and said, okay, maybe I could do something like that, but I am not going to be a pastor. And God said, sure, you're not. And then I got to my senior year of college, and my faith started to fall apart. I had just finished a really difficult summer internship at a Christian summer camp that had me seriously questioning my calling. And the kind of strained relationship that I had had with the Christian culture I had grown up in was reaching a breaking point. I stopped going to church. I failed chapel my senior year. If anyone else went to a Christian college that has required chapel attendance, we can commiserate after church. I failed chapel. I was pretty bitter toward the church and Christianity. My wife, Hannah, could tell you about many conversations we had during that year where I said I wasn't sure if I was really a Christian or if I really believed in God. I was floundering. And meanwhile, I was about to graduate college with a degree in Christian ministry and had zero marketable skills outside of ministry contexts. So not knowing what to do, I started applying for jobs at churches. And in a way that I absolutely could not have planned or predicted, I stumbled into being hired here as the youth director. And it took a while. There's more to the story, but here my faith eventually began to be rehabilitated. My sense of calling came back so that now I am on track toward ordination to become a pastor. And so when thank you. So when I read this story about Jacob wrestling with God and holding on until he received a blessing, I very much see my own story. And I'm sure there are lots of us in this congregation who could tell similar stories of times where we found ourselves unexpectedly wrestling with God. And then where we hung on when things were most difficult, and when we came out on the other side, maybe limping, but blessed and feeling like a new creation. This happens, and it's not something that happens just once. In my own life of faith, me and God are on pretty good terms right now, but I fully expect more wrestling in the future, because that's just the way this works. It's not a bug, it's a feature of the life of faith. It's always going to be a winding road. And we can choose to rage against that, or we can learn to trust the process and follow wherever the path leads. Now, we're in the middle of a sermon series about prayer, and it may not sound like we've been talking about prayer up to this point, but we totally have. One of the basic ideas behind this series is that prayer doesn't just look like folding our hands and closing our eyes and asking God for something. Prayer is anything we do to intentionally connect with God, and we can do that in lots of different ways as we're exploring in this series. So this is why Paul can say something in 1 Thessalonians like, pray without ceasing. Of course, we can't literally kneel at our bedsides and pray that way without ceasing. But we can work toward living in intentional connection with God in every moment of our lives. And what this story of Jacob reminds us is that sometimes that connection with God is going to be nice and wholesome. And sometimes we connect with God the same way a bat connects with a baseball. And that's not a bad thing. That's okay. The process of growing in faith is not about getting rid of our struggles or doubts. It's about how we respond when those doubts and struggles come. When things get hard, we can choose to cut and run, or we can choose to engage, to dig in, to keep wrestling until we find a blessing. Now, our faith tradition has a spiritual technology that can really help us meditate on this idea and actually put it into bodily practice. It's called a labyrinth, which that's a labyrinth right there. This is a labyrinth in a cathedral in Chartres, France. You can see that it is a path laid out on the floor with a winding walking path. And what you do simply is you begin on the outside and you follow the path into the center and then back out. And you can see that it looks similar to a maze, but a crucial distinction is that a labyrinth doesn't have any wrong turns or dead ends. So the path is complicated, but you can't get lost. You can't make a wrong turn. If you keep walking, you will make your way to the center and you will find your way back out. Now, Christians have been using labyrinths for a very long time. The earliest one that we know of is located in Algiers, and it's dated to around the year 325 AD. So very old. But interestingly, we don't have anything written by the early Christians about how exactly labyrinths were used or what their significance was. So it's a little bit of a blank slate. The best that we can tell is that they were likely connected to Christian pilgrimages, which were, long journeys to important holy sites or historical sites. So labyrinths may have been used as kind of alternatives to going on these longer pilgrimages, or in the case of that labyrinth at Chartres, as the final stage of a pilgrim's journey. So on a basic level, the labyrinth is a miniature representation of the winding journey of life, particularly a life lived in connection to God. So it's common to imagine that center area as a place of unity with God. So we begin on the outside as kind of a disconnected individual. And then we step foot on the path, following its loops and twists and turns until we reach that central goal of true connection with God. And in the center, we might rest for a while. And then eventually, when we're ready, we begin the journey back out, carrying that renewed connection with us as we go out to love and serve our neighbors. I had a really powerful first experience with walking a labyrinth during my senior year of college when my faith was in the middle of falling apart. And I remember stepping onto the path and looking toward that center area and feeling so intimidated. It was like there was this blazing fire in the middle of the labyrinth that I was afraid to get too close to. It felt dangerous almost. And I started walking, and much sooner than I expected, the path took me right on the outside of the center area, and it felt almost unbearable to be so close to the middle so quickly. But thankfully, mercifully, the path soon turned back again, and I was back on the outside feeling safe. But then it turned back toward the middle again, and things went on like this, going toward the middle and back out, in and out. And as I went along, I remember finding myself being more and more strangely drawn to the center. I would get this kind of feeling of nervous, excited anticipation when the path turned me toward the center, and then a feeling of disappointment when I started walking back toward the edge. And then I remember finally reaching the center, and I had this strong feeling of relief and peace that I just wanted to bask in for as long as I could. And so I sat there, and then eventually I got another feeling that it was time for me to go back out into the world, the work that God was calling me to. So this experience by no means solved the faith struggles I was having, but what it did was to help me see that I wasn't separated from God in the midst of my struggles. Me and God were still with each other, still connected, even if we were wrestling with each other at that point. And it gave me strength and hope to stay in the fight rather than running away.